Welcome back to episode 6 of Faraday Tech Cafe and the final episode of season 1. I am your host, Gwendolyn Faraday, and in this podcast, we bring you interesting stories, information about new technologies, and fresh perspectives from around the development community. This episode is a continuation of my interview with Joe Kaufeld, a software developer and accessibility enthusiast currently working at the Kenzie Academy Coding School. In this episode, we discuss how developers can make the web a more accessible place and dive into the topic of accessibility in coding education programs like coding schools. That I recently had an experience with keyboards in a website. I was making a draw menu for this site, and I'm using a component library for JavaScript. The person who made this library made it with a lot of accessibility features in mind, so they specifically wrote that you can navigate around all of these elements with a keyboard, and it uses the escape key to close the draw and that slides in from the side. I just thought, wow, I never even considered doing that, as I've been making menus and things for so many years.
Yeah, that's really clever.
Yeah. People say that if we all developed with certain limitations like programming on slow hotel Wi-Fi, that the web would be a really, really different place than what it is.
I absolutely believe that. I endorse that. I think we should shove all the developers in a hotel Wi-Fi for a little while because I really do think that would make a massive difference. Something that we talked about earlier was just developing against things that we don't experience ourselves. And that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind. It is something that we did not discuss earlier was developing for issues that you do have experience with. So something that kind of ties into what we talked about earlier, and this is like what happens if you do have some kind of condition or some kind of disability that requires the kind of accessibility standards that we're talking about implementing. So if we're looking at the web as kind of the conglomeration of all of our experiences, we do tend to suffer, as an industry, we tend to suffer from more or less everyone having a very similar outlook on things. And it's also really interesting when you consider the fact that as an industry, there is one specific disability that strikes developers far more commonly than basically anything else, and that's RSI. Well, generalized RSI, because RSI is in itself, a repetitive stress injury, can really be like a dozen different things, but it all manifests itself in a very similar way. Repetitive actions, like typing, cause problems with pain, cause usability problems for people like you and me. And this is actually something that I struggle with, and it's something that has forced me to change my personal workflow for actually a fair number of things. There are some days where I can't actually really use a keyboard. There are a lot of days where I can't use a standard QWERTY keyboard, actually. My keyboard of choice is the Kinesis Advantage, which is a very cool keyboard. It's also very expensive, and I can't afford to have more than one of them. So if it breaks, I'm screwed. But in a general sense, that's also led me and people like me to exploring different methods of development, where accessibility isn't just a part of the development process, but it's a requirement for developing. I use a system, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes I use a system called Talon, which pairs with Dragon Naturally Speaking to actually write fluent code simply through voice. And I don't have to touch the keyboard at all, which if my wrists are having an awful day, or if my arms are hurting, then sometimes that is the best I can do. But when you're using your voice is simply an extension of the keyboard at that point, which leads us back to the earlier point of, can you navigate your website with just your keyboard? And the answer sometimes is no, you can't. There's a lot of the internet that you can't navigate with your keyboard, and there's a lot of the internet that you can't navigate with your voice. And that just brings us back to being aware of these issues so that we can correct for them and so that we can catch them in our own work.
Yeah, that's definitely important. I want to switch gears a little bit here and
Sure.
get to you being a teacher at the coding school. So you have a lot of different students. I think you work in 3-month batches. You
Yes.
are in charge of students for the last 3 months before they graduate. So as you
Uh-huh.
get new students and then graduate students, do you see many students, or I guess what kind of adjustments have you had to make in terms of accessibility for the students that you teach there?
So, in terms of the students that I interact with on a regular basis, most of the issues that I face in terms of accessibility with these students is going back to the very first question that we tackled of the definition of accessibility, is more the second definition of income inequality, where everyone may not have access to the same time allowances that I do or people like me do. They may have kids. They may be caring for elder relatives. They may have family emergencies. They may have a second job or a third job. And these are things that have to be worked around, because part of my job is to make sure that they have the best experience possible. And that includes being flexible, and that includes being as accessible as I can and providing content in such a way that no matter what you're currently going through as a person, especially relevant in today with the coronavirus and other things, it's a huge part of my job of making sure that everyone has access to be able to participate and to complete the curriculum and to learn, because that really is my goal. Is I want to help people learn. When we start the quarter every time, I always sit them down and I explain that, you know what, we're going to cover these things. You know, we're going to cover X, Y, and Z. We're going to spend a lot of time specifically covering this, and here's why, and yada, yada. And then at the end, I say, you know what, it doesn't really matter what we cover, really, at the end of this. Because if I've done my job right, if I have enabled you to learn, if I've enabled you to learn these concepts and to take these concepts and turn them into something that you can act on, you should be able to graduate out of here in 3 months. Because by the time they get to me, they've only got 3 months left. So they should be able to graduate out of my class and go work in Fortran and COBOL and be totally fine. Beyond the initial ramp-up time of actually learning the syntax, because really that's pretty much all that changes. You know, you're learning the syntax and various little quirks of a new language, but the concepts more or less remain the same. You learn how to learn. You learn how to research. You learn how to find answers to things that are bugging you or things that are just behaving strangely. If you're working with Python or working with, Django and making these large applications, if you're dealing with CORS errors and you have to research how in the world does CORS work, which is cross-origin resource sharing, which is a pain in the... But if you're dealing with something like this, then the same skills that you learn in order to research these problems that you encounter as a student, you're going to take these same skills and you're going to apply them to work environments, and you're going to apply them to whatever language you go and you work in, even if it's something like PHP or Java or COBOL.
Okay, that makes sense. So for the people who might not have the best financial resources going into the program, maybe they have to work at the same time that they're going to the coding boot camp, do you see them have additional struggles on top of the normal learning?
Yeah. Minor nitpick. It's not really a boot camp. Because a boot camp more is like a couple of weeks, 12 weeks max. This is 52 weeks. It's a full year.
Right, sorry.
And during that time, we request that students take normal business hours and be available for those normal business hours. So student hours are actually 9 to 3, which makes it well nigh impossible to hold down a standard job, more or less, while you are attending Kenzie. Some folks, because they have to, hold down a night job or an evening job at the very least, just to bring in a little bit of extra income for the people who need it. We also offer various ways of generating income by either assisting with quarters that you've already been through or serving as a coach, and that does help. But in general, in more direct answer to your question, the folks who do have to hold down a job in order to survive, because that's where they are in life or that's the cards that they've been dealt, then yeah, they do struggle more. And that's something that we as instructors have to be aware of, and it's something that we want to make sure that we are cognizant of that and we reflect our recognition of those circumstances. Because if we just blindly assign the same thing to everybody, and we assign the same due dates to everybody, and we assign the same restrictions to everybody, then sometimes you're giving the raw end of the deal to people who don't deserve it. And it's part of our job to understand what some of the extra trials and tribulations that a student is going through. And it's part of our job to make sure that we level the playing field and we make everything as accessible as possible. There's a comic that comes to mind of three boys trying to watch a baseball game over the fence. All three boys are different heights, and one boy can see over the fence with no problem. The other two have varying levels of difficulty because they're both shorter than the top of the fence. So in the first panel, we have a bunch of boxes where the person who doesn't need it is on all of the boxes, and they can see very well, but the other two can't really see. And then the second panel is the boxes evenly distributed, so even though the child who is the shortest has the most boxes, everyone's head is at the same level and they can all see. And I think that this is a really valuable way of looking at some of the ways that we approach both curriculum and we approach working with students. Because it's not that we want to give, so-and-so an extra bonus, or it's not that we want to give them extra time in order to complete something. It's giving them an extra box so that they can stand more easily at the same level as the students who maybe come from more affluent families who don't have to worry about where their next paycheck is going to come from. It's students who don't have kids, don't have to worry as much about, well, I got to go pick up my kid from school, or he's sick, or, things like that. Students who live on their own don't have to worry about caring for an elderly parent, or don't have to worry about suddenly becoming the executor of a will, or things like that. And those are things that we can reflect on, and those are things that we can use to help make the student experience better for everybody.
That's great that you can work with students and kind of be flexible with their needs. I also want to ask about mental disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So what about students who have maybe ADHD or are on the autism spectrum, for example?
Uh-huh.
Are there accessibility considerations that you make for them?
The answer is yes, but it is kind of a complicated yes, because everyone has different requirements and everyone has different needs. There is only so much that we can do up to the bounds of what science understands and how we can best interact with different students. So there have been students that I've worked with who have, for example, had their own therapist where they introduced their therapist to us so that we could work with them and make sure that we approached specific situations in specific ways that benefited both the regular student body and people who had these specific considerations. We've also put research into, at this time, we haven't yet been able to implement it, but we've done some research into and talked to several therapists about implementing a quiet room, a specific stimulus-free or as stimulus-free room as is humanly possible, because it's been shown that people with autism who are feeling overwhelmed, who are feeling like there is too much stimulus and they have difficulty handling that, science shows that having a white room or having a stimulus-free zone is very beneficial. A quiet room is extremely beneficial for people who need it. And eventually, as soon as we finish remodeling, we'll be able to have that, and we'll be able to provide that as an option for folks who need it. Now, there aren't very many folks who need it, but it doesn't have to be something that we advertise. It doesn't have to be something that's, trotted out on tours as, oh, hey, look, check this out. We've got a quiet room. It's something that we can provide as a service to the people who need it in order to succeed. And I don't think there's any shame in that. I don't think that there's any reason to not really provide that, because it's so important for some people's growth, and it's so important for someone's ability to really focus. And there are other companies who are taking this very seriously. Microsoft, for example, both Microsoft and Google have a specific autism hiring pipeline that is run by people with autism. The recruiters are diagnosed with autism, and they specifically seek out people who struggle with it or have been diagnosed. And that is really, really powerful, because it's putting people who need that job into the hands of people who understand what they are going through. They understand why this is more difficult, why sometimes the world is just too loud, why sometimes, the somewhat famous Asperger's breakdowns, which Asperger's is not really a thing anymore since the latest ism, but that's a completely different argument and conversation. But everyone knows the stereotypical autistic breakdown, and that's because the world is just too loud. And there's too much stimulus, and those are things that we can correct for. Those are things that we can assist people with, where, if they need an extra few minutes, yeah, let them have it. If they need a place to decompress as a company, that is such a small expense with such a fantastic return on investment. There's no reason for me as a company to not invest in something like that. Like, that is a fantastic move.
Especially with the autism unemployment rate being so high. I think it's up at maybe 50 to 70%.
I would 100% believe that.
So it's great that Microsoft is doing that.
Yeah, I'd believe it.
And I can also relate to needing a quiet room, having sometimes really, really bad social anxiety. I've asked companies before to be able to, have my own space, maybe work in an empty office or be able to work from home. And, usually that is granted because sometimes my anxiety just gets to be too high and I can't focus with lots of noise going on around me. So I think that's a really good thing you're doing for students. So we've definitely covered a lot of different topics concerning a broad range of accessibility issues and teaching. So if someone wants to get started learning about accessibility or perhaps helping make the web more accessible, what would you recommend? Where would you recommend that they start?
I think the first thing that you can do if you're just trying to help is to learn. Understand what different people are going through, what different people need in order to experience the same things that we do. Because establishing a baseline is a really important thing, honestly. Like, if you're looking at just kind of your generic website, the same way that you use a website versus the way your mom uses a website, or your grandma or your grandpa, there's going to be some major differences there. And it's not just differences in technological prowess, it's also differences that happen to everybody. Age increases the time required to understand things. It decreases abilities and senses like hearing and things like that. And those things impact your ability to understand different websites, and it impacts your ability to use different systems. So even just the generic things that happen to all of us, understanding what that actually looks like, even if it doesn't affect you personally, understanding what that looks like is a huge, huge step. Absolutely huge. And I think that if it's a step that you haven't taken, if it's something that maybe doesn't make a whole lot of sense, then that's something that really you should investigate. The next thing would be just finding people who have experiences different than you. As a fairly average male in software development, I know there are so many voices and so many experiences that I don't hear as a regular part of my interactions in the software development industry. Most of my coworkers are standard males in software development. That's what it breaks down to, unfortunately. If you find yourself in a position where you're hearing the same voices, maybe it's time for a change. Maybe it's time to be uncomfortable, and maybe it's time to seek out things and seek out worldviews and seek out experiences that you don't normally have, because that's wildly important. Even just knowing, understanding that there are different experiences out there, that will help you be a better developer, and that will help you create experiences that are more accessible to everyone. Straight up. That's logic right there. And there's really no way to get around that. In terms of actually wanting to make the web more accessible, your own work is a fantastic place to start. If you've got an application that you're really proud of, that you like to show off for interviews and say, this is the thing that I made and I'm so proud of it and I put so much time into it. If you can't get around your own app with a keyboard, something's got to change. And if anything, you can spin it into a great follow-up for future interviews. Like, if this really is your interview show-off piece, then you can have a whole section about, hey, how, you wrote this, you're really proud of it, and then you found out, maybe it wasn't as accessible as you'd thought it was. Maybe it wasn't as accessible as you'd hoped. And then you can show that you took the steps to make it accessible. That is a fantastic point from an interview perspective. But starting with your own applications is definitely the best place to actually start understanding what these problems are and what they look like as part of regular development. If you're writing a front end, for example, and you don't have alt text, to a sighted person, that's not going to be immediately apparent. If you turn on VoiceOver, or if you're on a Windows machine, NVDA or NDVA, I always get that mixed up, just really any screen reader application, and start going through your website. Learning to use a screen reader, I think, is an incredibly valuable skill, and it's something that does take a little bit of practice. But with a little bit of time and just even a few hours of usage, you can get up to some really impressive speeds. But if you are navigating your website and you find that the actual experience of using your website is not actually what you wanted it to be, that's a problem. When someone's using your project, they are seeing your interpretation of your idea. And if they can't actually access it, and if they can't actually grasp your concept the way that you wanted, that's a problem. They cannot access your project. And so that's why I think that starting with your own stuff is definitely the best place. There are lots of different volunteerism opportunities available. There's stuff, for example, there's descriptive opportunities out there. So you can do transcription for free a lot of times through a lot of different places. I mean, my nonprofit deals very heavily in transcription, but I want to point the spotlight at some other places first. So we'll circle back to that. Some ways that you can volunteer are if you know, for example, if you know sign language. There are lots of positions available as a volunteer or paid sign language interpreter. Even if you're not very good at it, sometimes having somebody who's not very good at it is way better than not having anybody at all. If the option is not getting anything versus having a little, yeah, sometimes it's better to have a little. You've got some other options with adding captions. Adding captions to things is criminally underrated. I don't think that people actually understand how vitally important adding captions is to things. As a volunteer, you can add captions to almost everything on YouTube. It's free, it's available, and you can just go and do it. A lot of times you do have to submit captions to the uploader so that they can approve it, but it's totally free, and you can just do it. If you've got an uploader that you really like on YouTube, adding captions to their videos is very appreciated. There is a set of paid services that can be used for this sort of thing, but that's pretty much exclusively locked away to the YouTubers who make a lot of money. And your average person who's uploading videos does not have access to those types of services. So being interested, being willing, being able to sit down and create captions for a video is super, super useful. There are websites, Subscene immediately comes to mind, where if you want the practice, you can subtitle a whole movie and just put your subtitle file up for other people to use. And that is, more often than not, an actual individually driven exercise. It's not something that that is commissioned most often. It's something that you actually have to do, or someone has to sit down and say, you know what, I'm going to do this because I see a need, or I have a need to make this a reality. And things like that, captions especially, are a huge, huge source of accessibility for people that a lot of people don't even think about. Another big one, and I'm going to circle back to my own organization. So the thing that we do, that we focus on, is internet transcriptions, taking photographs, videos, and audio, and just creating standard text versions of them. Because everybody can work with text. Like, it's the one true unifier of the internet, basic ASCII text. If you need a screen reader, you've got access to text. If you need to zoom in really, really far to see what's happening, you've got access to text. If you're super dyslexic, and you need a special font in order to actually understand the words, or else they get all jumbled on the page, you've got text. You can turn it into whatever font you want. If you're colorblind, then if the specific colors that aren't working for a site or that are on a site aren't working for you, you can set it to whatever the hell you want. It's just text. And so because text is the universal constant here, what we do is we work with folks who need it, usually the blind or heavily colorblind, heavily dyslexic. That's our primary audience. People come to us and they bring content primarily. They say, look, this is something that I would like to access, but I can't. This is something that I physically cannot access. And we pair them up with a volunteer to create a text version of that content. One that immediately comes to mind is a man who is now a very good friend of mine, is completely blind, has been blind since birth. Huge Harry Potter fan. Like, he loves Harry Potter. And when the illustrated editions came out, the illustrated edition for, I think it was the Sorcerer's Stone, he brought the cover to us and said, look, I'm blind. Please explain to me what the cover art looks like, because this is the illustrated edition. Someone went to a lot of effort to make this symbolize the book, to make this actually reminiscent of the story. So what all's happening? What does this actually look like? And we generated hundreds of words about the cover of the Harry Potter book, because that's what's needed to make sure that everybody's on the same level and everybody's participating in the same conversation. We also do it kind of as a pro bono service for people who may need it but don't bring it to us. So we're primarily on Reddit. If you're on reddit.com, which I believe is still the fourth most popular website in the world now, but if you're on reddit.com and you see a comment that ends in "I'm a human volunteer transcriber for Reddit and you could be too," that is one of our volunteers. We have a little over 3,000 volunteers now, and we have a bunch of subreddits, 72 or 73 right now, who actively ask us to come work on their content as it's posted, so that people can find these transcriptions and find these descriptions of the content as it's needed, more or less in real time. And that is a really, really powerful thing that we are given the ability to do, and that's something that we are really honored to facilitate. Because if you're trying to just join in the regular conversation on Reddit, let's say your internet craps out, won't load the image, or something else happens, you can still participate in the conversation if you've got the text version. We've also worked with some other developers to do things like automatically scroll to the transcription if one is found on the page. And that's really helpful for people who have screen readers or just really like our work. But it's something that increases accessibility for everyone at the cost of, a comment that you can minimize if you don't like it. Doesn't take up too much space, but it's something that helps level the playing field for everybody. And everything that I just went through is volunteer. You can just sit down. In the case of my system, in the case of we actually have a 501c3 nonprofit that you can volunteer with. In our case, it's something that you can sit down and spend as little as 5 minutes. You can spend as much as 8 hours in a single sitting just going and creating these things for people who need them. And that's really, really powerful. It's really amazing that you can make such a difference with so little effort.
So this was a lot of really good information, and thank you so much for sharing your passions with us about accessibility and education. Do you have any final words or anything else maybe I missed that you want to talk about here?
I don't really think that we've missed anything. I mean, we've covered so much, and there is so much more that we could talk about, but honestly, the core concepts are here. The core pieces of what makes the internet an important place and what makes accessibility so important, especially on the internet, we did cover that. And I think that if anything, if people come away from this with just one thing, it's that accessibility, honestly, is not something that you can just overlook. It feels like it's something that you can overlook a lot of the time, but it's really deeply not. And the more effort that you put in the beginning to understanding what accessibility is and what accessibility looks like for your particular project or projects, the easier it will be in the long term, and the more goodwill you will automatically earn from the folks who need the systems that you're building, who need access to the types of things that you're currently working on.
Awesome. So, do you have any additional resources that you would recommend people check out?
If you're just interested in a little light reading, the Section 508 compliance sector is actually kind of interesting. As I said earlier, it's certainly not really riveting, but it is interesting, and it's especially interesting when you look at it from the context of these are the things that the U.S. government has deemed important enough to codify. And when you look at it from that perspective, the U.S. government does have a lot of different people in it. It has a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of people with a lot of different physical capabilities and potentially mental capabilities and all sorts of different things. And so the things that they collectively thought were important enough to codify are probably things that are important enough for you to know, at the very least. Take a spin through it. At least see what the important parts are. The W3C guidelines are a really great, if anything, refresher on the types of things that every website really should be able to do. Really should have at least some semblance of. Can you navigate your website with a keyboard? Do you have alt text? Is your stuff labeled? These are sometimes really basic things that we really take for granted. As far as specific resources, besides those two, I don't really have anything that I really want people to look into. But what I would recommend is, especially if you're a front-end developer, every piece of documentation, every set of documentation for every major front-end framework has at least one chapter on accessibility with that framework. The React docs have a chapter on accessibility. The Vue docs have a fantastic set of examples about accessibility. There is someone on those teams who spent the time to write out how to do it the right way using your chosen framework. And it is well worth your time. Even if you're using something basic like Bootstrap or something like that, it is well worth your time as a developer to sit down and understand how to do it right using your systems of choice, using the tools that you've chosen for your application. There is a way to do it right, and it's up to you to recognize and learn what that way is and how to implement it for your applications.
Yes, and that's one of the things I like the most about Vue.js is the emphasis on accessibility and making it easy for all different types of people to use. I think they've really set a gold standard there as far as frameworks go.
Absolutely. It's like mentioned in their first ever example in the docs. It's like, hey, look, this is an example of an accessible thing. Use it, damn it.
So where can people find you online?
Oh boy, I'm floating around all sorts of places. You can find me differently based on what project you're finding me for, but as a general rule, anywhere you see the username It's the Joker, one word, that's likely me on Reddit, on GitHub, on Twitter. Actually, on Twitter, I think I'm at Joe Kaufeld. That's K-A-U, F as in Frank, E-L-D as in dog. And if you want to actually get a hold of me for nonprofit-related things, then you can find us on Reddit at r/transcribers of Reddit. I'm not going to spell that, sorry. But you can find us there. If you want to look at us from the nonprofit perspective, you can find us online at grapheus.org. That is actually the name of our nonprofit. It's the Grapheus Group, and that's G-R-A, F as in Frank, E-A-S, Grapheus. And that's actually Greek for scribe. Fun fact. Actually, it's just a really nerdy fact. I'm not sure it's fun, but it's nerdy. And so that's actually where most of our stuff is held right now. We are in the process of changing that website out for a brand spanking new system. The one that's currently up hasn't actually been updated in a while. Hopefully by the time this goes live, I'll have it updated. If it has a white background, you're looking at the old one. If it doesn't have a white background, then thankfully you're finally looking at the new system. But grapheus.org is us. We're also on GitHub. The group is just Grapheus Group. One word is our GitHub account. And the reason I specify that is because almost all of our stuff, we are actually working on this very hard, but almost all of our stuff is open source, licensed MIT. So everything that we work on is accessibility first. And I'm not saying that we're definitely the gold standard or anything, but what I am saying is that we've taken a lot of care into making our stuff as accessible as possible. And if you're interested in seeing what that looks like, then you can find us at github.com/grapheusgroup. Yeah, and if you want to find me through email, it's just joe@grapheus.org.
Basically, you're everywhere.
That's a good thing, right?
Thanks so much for coming on the show, Joe. This was all really good information.
Absolutely. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Faraday Tech Cafe. Don't forget that all of the info and items that were mentioned during the podcast are listed in the show notes for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a positive review on your podcasting platform of choice. For questions or feedback related to the show, you can email us at contact@faradayacademy.com. And don't forget to check out our YouTube channel for more great content on a variety of programming topics. Subscribe to the podcast so you can get notified when Season 2 starts up this summer. Until next time.